On behalf of the Elmhurst Historical Museum and Elmhurst Our Kind of Town, this is Elmhurst Time Travelers. I'm Ken Bartels, your host, and this episode we have two charming and very distinctive guests, Virginia Stewart and Joanne Brundage. And ladies, welcome to Elmhurst Time Travelers. Very delighted to have you both here today. As you would know, this program is one where we sit and we talk to folks with knowledge of Elmhurst history and a certain amount of participation in it as well. And I wanted to start off with a question I'd like to have both of you answer, and that is, how long have you been in Elmhurst? And what specific connections have you had with the Historical Museum during that time? And Virginia, we'll just start with you.
Well, my family moved to Elmhurst in 1953, and we grew up in Pick subdivision, so we were kind of on the fringes of Elmhurst until I went to York. My connections with the Historical Museum are long. I started working as a consultant archivist here, and then moved from that position to the first director, and was here until 1987 when I went back to graduate school.
Joanne?
Well, I guess I have to reveal my age if we're going to talk about how long I've been here, because I was born in a hospital outside of Elmhurst, but as soon as I got out, I was in Elmhurst. That was 1952, and been in Elmhurst for the majority of my life, actually. You know, little forays away to college and lived in Glen Ellen for a few years. Other than that, I've been in Elmhurst all my life. And as far as the Historical Museum, I actually got involved with the Historical Society about 24 years ago or so, and have had a lot of delightful volunteer opportunities at the museum and work with the museum in conjunction with the society on a lot of projects over the last couple decades.
So we're spanning a reasonable period of time for both of you, and I've been in town 30 years myself. So some memories that immediately come to mind of childhood and perhaps York High School or high school age, and then a little bit further on. Just some things that pop into your mind, or quite frankly that you've thought about ahead of time. Joanne?
Well, I noticed you've asked before about earliest memories, and so I thought of two or three, actually. The most ongoing one when I was very little was Wilder Park and the library. I spent a lot of time there with my parents, taking walks and going to the library. And so there's a lot of fond memories there. In fact, so much so that when the garden was put up and the pavers were put in that you could, inscribe, we got a brick, commemorating all the walks in the park that I'd had with my dad as a little kid. But I also thought of something that I'm not sure on the date, but I do remember when I was very little going to Walter Rohmeyer's farm. Apparently there'd been a fire, and I just have this vague memory of going with my mom to, other people were there picking over things. This is actually where York's football field is now.
Right.
But I actually looked up, the history. I thought, well, am I remembering something that I fabricated? But I had to be no more than 3 or 4 tops at the time. And the other very clear memory I had was of the Chicago, Aurora, and Elgin train that we lived right across the station. That was at Spring Road, and I remember very fondly, absolutely just walking across the street from where I lived, getting on a train and getting off at Marshall Fields on State Street.
Wow.
And that train went away when I was 4.
Yeah,
so,
we've had other guests comment on,
but it was wonderful.
on that line. Yeah.
Well, and of course, Spring Road wouldn't exist as a business district had it not been for the train.
I'm a little more scattered, I think, in my memories because I grew up on Pick Avenue, just a couple of blocks from the creek. My dad and our neighbor to the north used to go down and fish in Salt Creek, and sometimes he took me with. And The creek was very wild at that point, and there was almost no housing built there at all. So there was a big open prairie, and then you just sort of wended your way down to the creek and sat on the banks. And he caught catfish and bullheads in the creek. When he brought them home, my mother said, get rid of those. I'm not doing anything with them. So I have this memory of these really large kind of trash fish swimming around in the big concrete wash tubs in the basement until he found something to do with them. I never knew exactly what. The other thing about, I was thinking about my later childhood. I'm a little older than you, so I was out and about on my own a little more at that time. There was regular bus service on St. Charles Road and into downtown, quite frequent, twice an hour. And so as a young child still in junior high school, I was allowed to get on the bus and go downtown and go to the York Theater with my girlfriend or with a group of students. And my mother would give me a quarter, and that would cover everything. Bus fare to and back, and it was 12 cents to get into the York Theater, and then there was a nickel left over for some kind of a treat. And when I think about that, a quarter, it's pretty startling. But it's also startling, I think, that we were not unusual. Young children, 8, 9, 10, etc., got around on their own, on their bikes or on public transportation easily. My parents did not drive us places, and that's a big difference.
Well, and we've heard this in other episodes where people will describe the fact that they would leave in the morning, and particularly in the summertime, they'd leave in the morning, and the admonition from mom was be home before dark.
Right.
Which leads to a concept of neighborhoods and safety, but we don't need to go into the safety so much as recollection of your neighborhoods growing up. I mean, you've already described a little bit of yours, Virginia.
Well, Pitt was and still is kind of a little out of the way place. For those of your viewers who don't know, it's the little strip of land between 83 and Villa Avenue and between St. Charles Road and North Avenue. Part of it is actually still unincorporated. And it had been a farm before it was developed in the 1920s. And it was very unevenly developed, a lot of things still not built on in the late 50s. And so it had a much more, I won't say rural, that's not, but it was less defined than it is now, with every lot built up and people with fences, etc. You could just sort of roam around there. And there was very little traffic. We played in the street always. Dodgeball, baseball. We played tennis in the street, etc. And that kind of troop of kids of a range of ages would play together. And we did play until the Fireflies came out. That was the...
And then you collected them.
Right, in those jars, and then went home. The other part of it, I think, is that as a child, you don't have a sense of a bigger neighborhood. You just have places you can get to. Mm-hmm. And I've already mentioned going downtown to the York. We also took the bus to East End Park, which had the only swimming pool.
Right.
And once again, we were it was considered just fine to do that. Your Girl Scout troop, everything was sort of right in that immediate neighborhood.
Right. Well, and since I lived on a business street, I adopted my neighborhood this block over on Hillside. Mm-hmm. And I remember similarly that, we would just be out all day and, have to show up. And I remember very clearly that the mothers would come out. For us, it was when the streetlights came on. Mm-hmm. That's when you had to go home. And so we'd sort of linger a little bit until the moms all came out to fetch us. And then if we could figure it out how to get them to talk to one another,
we could stay out
we
longer.
could stretch it out another half an hour or so. But yeah, I just like you, I remember actually riding bikes all over town. That's how we got to the library, and we called it Uptown. We were going uptown since I lived on the south end. We'd go uptown to the theater or to Honey Girl or, any number
Right.
of places. And I do remember when Oak Brook Shopping Center came in, that was very thrilling for, young ladies, especially, in taking the bus with
Right.
friends around middle school age.
I want to move up just a little bit. Next year, 2011, is the city's 175th anniversary. And I know both of you were obviously in town and involved with the 150th anniversary in 1986. And I wondered specific memories that come to mind when I mentioned that year and that event. And Joanne, I'll start with you on that one, because you were you with City Center at that point? Or did that come
No. I'm sure you were very involved, but I remember distinctly because my second child was born that year, who kind of wreaked havoc with our lives. But so it's all kind of jumbled up. I remember half the battle was being able to say sesquicentennial.
Yes.
That was a
Well, at least we
mouthful.
don't have to spell it.
Right, but I do remember it very fondly, and I remember sewing a prairie dress and bonnet for my daughter, who I believe was in the parade for the museum. Maybe that was the same year, and at the same time, I had just quit my job after working 10 years at the Elmhurst Post Office. So the sad news was that we kind of plummeted income-wise that year unexpectedly. Didn't plan on quitting, but Zach had other plans. And being very sad because I couldn't get Carrie, our daughter, any souvenirs. There were a lot of festivities that summer, and, so it hurts. But, but it was, we went to a lot of the activities, and that was wonderful.
I remember going to a planning meeting. I was director of the museum at that time, and so I was thinking that pretty much we had history locked up, in the museum community. And it was really surprising to me to see the tremendous range of people who had a stake, who took a stake in the sesquicentennial, the chamber, the various men's and women's clubs, civic organizations, etc. It was eye-opening for me, and a really good lesson to reach out much more strongly to the community. And I think that getting the caboose here, which was a railroad caboose that was parked just north of the railroad tracks at York Street, gave the sesquicentennial a physical presence that people could say this is something different, this is something new, and from that, just a tremendous amount of activities emerged. At the museum, we had been fortunate enough to win a competitive grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities to redo our entire exhibition space. And so we were deep involved in finding the artifacts, telling the story, working with the production crew, etc., on two exhibits, one that is still available to be seen, Visions of Home on the second floor of the museum, and then one which was very focused on celebration as a civic activity, in which we looked at the centennial of Elmhurst, which had been 50 years previous, and also looked at some of the things that we anthropologists call the festive year, the calendar of civic events that take place, the holiday events around the turn of the year, other things like that, to really show people how enormously structured the year is, how much is going on, and how much of that contributes to making Elmhurst a community-minded place because of celebrating together, etc. And I got to work with Pat Sheffer as the commentator on the parade, and that was lots of fun.
Now, you both could have chosen to live elsewhere or leave Elmhurst for any number of reasons, whether it was family or work. And we're in the second segment, I want to talk about both of you working outside of the home. But what about Elmhurst has caused you to stay the years that you have?
Well, I frankly can't imagine not living here. And in fact, as my children got older, I was a little bit concerned, especially when our oldest, Carrie, went off to college. I thought, oh no, she's going to meet a man and go off to the hinterland somewhere.
Yeah, move to Alaska.
And, right, something like that. Well, happily that didn't happen, and now she lives 4 blocks away from us. In the north part of Elmhurst, I don't know, it's just a place where you stay. And I've heard that over a number of years, that Elmhurst overall has a higher number of people who just, I mean, how could you not love it? As you say, Virginia, it's got such a strong sense of community, I think, and there's so many resources. And, speaking for myself, I'm actually second-generation native. My grandfather, was a developer back in the teens and the 20s, and so I just feel like a lot of me is woven into this place. So I
Certainly.
Well, I certainly agree with everything you've said. In our case, I'd gotten married right after college, and we went off to graduate school, and then we had to make a decision, where my husband was going to take a job, because at that time that was the way you made those decisions.
Right, yeah.
And so he said, well, I don't see any reason not to move back where our families are, and we did. First rented and then bought a house that we're still in. And I think one of the things that is good for Elmhurst, this longevity that you have, is the fact that there are a lot of different ways you can live in Elmhurst. You can live in an apartment, you can live in a condo, you can live in a single-family house, you can move one place or another in town. There's a lot of options for people. And I think that means that you don't have to move away to achieve what it is that you want in housing. And so from that point of view, I've been really generally positive about the infill housing that's been done, because I think it gives people options they didn't have before, when the housing stock had largely been built in the 70s and there wasn't much new being done because we were out of land.
A couple of quick things before we go to break. Favorite place right now in the city, other than your home? Which,
Well, that was good to put in that caveat. I have to say, probably the library is still my favorite place.
Right, and I'm with her in there. That's where I'm headed after the taping.
I love that place. I mean, for many more reasons than just, the resources there. It's just a beautiful place.
It is. It is. I couldn't agree with you more. I loved the old library. I remember it as a child, as you were talking about the children's room in the basement with the knotty pine, right?
Yeah,
right, and the little chairs and tables. And now, I find it a wonderful place, particularly because when I'm at home, you get interrupted. But if you're in the library reading,
that's why I go there.
You're
Absolutely.
Sure.
in your own zone, and that's great.
Right, and at the same time, you run into people.
Absolutely.
My second favorite place to do that is Jewel, but the library is number one.
Exactly.
Virginia, I found a quote from 1983 in the Elmhurst Press.
Oh gosh.
And quote, "History is not an exact science," unquote. And I think I know what you meant by that, but I figured I'd let you tell us.
Well, I think that what I was trying to express there was that there's a difference between the past and history. The past occurred, and history is our attempt to regain awareness of that past. And it depends on what kinds of records have been left, how you pursue your research, etc. And that's why it's possible for hundreds of books to be written about the Civil War and Abraham Lincoln, because everyone is looking at a particular angle and working with a different group of materials. And that's why it's so important that the museum's collections are as broad as they possibly can be, because people come with different inquiries. We can't change the past. It occurred. We don't have any options there. But the stories that we tell about it depend on the questions that we ask and the sources that we have to work with. So in that sense, it has this sort of fluid capacity to it rather than just the facts.
Reaction?
Oh, I would agree. It's highly interpretive. I mean, and it is a matter of what you record and what you don't record and who's doing the recording and, So I agree. The more you have, the more apt you are to have more of those blanks filled in, but
Right.
it fascinates me. It did, especially I was going through school and especially college, to find out the history that most people don't know sometimes, things that happen that just sort of, for one reason or another,
Right.
didn't get paid attention to.
Or we enshrine it in a monument and we put up a plaque that says something very definite. And it may be
Right.
that not all that accurate, but it sure becomes literally carved in stone.
Right.
And then we walk by it without seeing it for
Exactly.
True
years
enough.
and
Right,
decades
right.
or
And
what
isn't
have
that true for, school kids especially, where it seems so dead, but really it's
Right.
pretty juicy.
I'm with you.
you. On that note, I think we'll take a break. This is Elmhurst Time Travelers, and we'll be right back.
The Elmhurst Historical Museum, located in downtown Elmhurst, is proud to present award-winning exhibits for visitors of all ages. Our Adult Tea Time Talk series, family programs, and special events make learning about history interesting and fun. Admission is free, and on-site parking is available. Visit the Elmhurst Historical Museum soon. Call us today, or go to our website for the latest program details.
This is Elmhurst Time Travelers. We're coming back from our break. I'm Ken Bartels, your host, and we're here with Virginia Stewart and Joanne Brundage. And ladies, I wanted to talk about both of your experiences working outside the home. Not at all an unusual phenomena now, but not so commonplace that long ago. And I know from reading up on both of you, I know we're talking, in your case, Joanne, about creating a job in the Elmhurst City Center, a job sharing, which was a pretty revolutionary notion at that point.
Absolutely.
I know about Mothers and More, and we need to know more about that as well. Virginia, I know you were working with manuscripts at the University of Illinois in Chicago. Mm-hmm. You've already mentioned your work here at the Historical Museum. Of course, now you are teaching history with a PhD, and I also have a book called Visionary, which is the latest publication, or still the latest publication, of the Elmhurst Historical Museum. So, Joanne, why don't we start with you? If you could just sort of give us a time capsule of how you transitioned from, if you will, mom or worker to mom to worker, or however that went.
Well, that was ugly. No, actually, it was seamless at the beginning. But yeah, well, it was ebb and flow because I graduated from York, 1970, and then I was on the 5-year plan at Northern Illinois University, so I graduated in 75 from there. And of course, I'm right in the middle of the baby boom, and anthropology major, so that was a rough road trying to find a job right out of college. But I did manage to, and interestingly, I carried mail for 10 years, almost. We had our daughter, and I continued working full-time, and everything seemed to be wonderful. And it was really a great job, I have to say. I was the 3rd female letter carrier there out of about 50 or so letter carriers, so it was a different environment, let's put it that way. I was dealing with a lot of men, didn't have any brothers, so it was interesting in that way, but it was also great because it was blue collar, it was men's work, and needless to say, the benefits and the pay were pretty darn good. Mm-hmm. And so compared with some of my friends from college, I was doing as well or better than some of them going into professions at that time. And I was very happy to be there, walking in the sunshine, getting paid for it. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we had our second child, Zach, in 1986, and he just turned out to not be so cool with, mom going back to work. And we spent a number of months actually trying to find some child care that was going to work. And at that time, we had a grade schooler, Carrie, who was going into 2nd grade at the same time Zach was born. So, there was a long story to that, but the bottom line was, we couldn't find anything that was going to work for us. So that was kind of rough because I think I was really a product of that second wave women's movement, and I think women my age in particular, had an interesting combo of background because in our childhood, we were, we experienced what we saw on TV, June Cleaver and Donna Reed and all of that.
Right.
And
Stay-at-home mom.
Exactly, even though I have to add that my mom actually worked full-time while I was in grade school. But that in itself was interesting because there was no lunch at school. So, my grade school experience was like, where are we going to send Joanne for lunch, And
To the boiler room?
No, actually it was to neighbors' houses for the most part.
Interesting.
But I have to just add a little personal interesting note that some of those lunches were spent at a good friend's house, Joni Peterson, who, as it turns out, then eventually became Mrs. Tom Borchert. So,
Oh, my goodness.
and we didn't realize that we knew each other again until, that's the strange thing about growing up. And then if you're a woman and you change your name,
Right.
you're not sure if you actually know
track.
people.
Sure.
But at any rate, so, I had that experience that was a little atypical when I was young of having a working mom. But what I actually kind of learned from that is it's important for a mother to be able to do what she needs to do for herself and her family. And so my mom was very, very distraught about working for a living, and yet I know that she also enjoyed her work a great deal. So I vowed that, I needed to do whatever I needed to do because, as they say, if mom ain't happy, ain't nobody happy, and I think that's a truism. So it was a big challenge when I quit, and at that point, 1986, that was the zenith of the woman who could fry it, bring home the bacon and fry it up in the pan,
Right, do it all.
and never let her husband forget that he's a man and all that good stuff. So it felt like, for me, leaving the workforce at that point felt like not only I had failed, but I'd kind of betrayed the sisterhood.
The movement.
And so, as you alluded to earlier, Ken, I ended up starting an organization. And it was basically just to find other women to talk to that were in the same place because we were quite invisible. Even though mothers as a group, it was about 50-50, those in the paid workplace at that point and those not. But so I started a group that the first name was Female, Formerly Employed Mothers at Loose Ends, which was the perfect name. Then you didn't have to explain anything, and the women that came that were interested knew exactly what we were talking about.
Yeah.
But, and looking back, it was exciting to realize that there have been two major mothers groups started in Elmhurst. First was La Leche.
Right. Extraordinary.
Started at Wilder
Yes.
Park at a picnic, and then Female that turned into Mothers and More. So that was a challenge, but then I kind of moved gradually back in as most mothers do, I think. And as you also mentioned, at a certain point in time, thanks to being a volunteer and meeting Pat Zubak, who was a local business owner as well in the downtown, we got to know each other. And then when Elmhurst City Center as a concept, a marketing and management nonprofit, came into being, Pat and I applied for that as a job share. And so that was a fabulous thing to be able to do as a mother. We both had kids around the same age and were able to spell each other. I mean, we would actually pick each other's sick kids up on occasion, depending on what kind of work we had to deal with. And so I would say Elmhurst was very accommodating, with these new ways of working. And, before that, I had done some desktop publishing, home-based business, worked with people at the EEDC, Elmhurst Economic Development Corporation, and local businesses. So it's been a great place. Again, why would you want to live somewhere else? I've been able to live here, raise my kids here, work here at all different levels. But it is a challenge, I think, and it remains a challenge for women to combine those two.
Right. I would second that. The critical thing is the daycare piece. And when I was growing up, there was a kinder care kind of place. I'm sure it had a different name on St. Charles Road, which was a day nursery, but only 3 days a week. And I asked my mother at one time, what is this? Is this school? Oh, no, she said in this sort of way, it's for children whose mothers have to work.
Right.
Mothers have to work. And so that was my orientation to it. Although my mother did not work outside the home, but she had a large professional piano student group. She taught piano for 40 years with as many as 30 to 35 students in a year's class. So she had, big commitments, but she felt that she resolved the inside the house, outside the house dilemma by teaching in her home. In my case, I also had this question of what to do after you have a little one. And so in that case, it was critically important that we were here where we had a family support network because my sisters lived far away. So my mother and my mother-in-law each took the baby one day when I went back to work at the university half-time. And that was another fortunate thing. Academic appointments, a little more flexible than other appointments. You can work out a half-time or a partial appointment. And I was able to do that for 3 years. And then, of course, I had the summers off, which made a tremendous difference. Then I got very involved in the YWCA. And the YWCA, particularly, I was on the board, the Chicago Metro Board. But the YWCA West Suburban was very committed to daycare. And I think my own experience was that if I hadn't had that family network, I wouldn't have been able to go back to work. Mm-hmm. So I was very interested in supporting that and seeing that that was a piece in place for women. And I think that I always tease that my husband has supported my history habit for all the decades of our marriage. When I talk to my students, my graduate students, I always say to them, you go into this kind of work, museum work, public history, local historical societies, etc., because you feel it's a calling. You will not make as much as a good high school teacher. And if you put together a nonlinear career, as I have, you may find in your 50s that you don't have certain things in place that are really vitally important for you as an older person. So I think that behind every successful career woman is a supportive and feminist husband, and one who's committed to the work as well, your work as well as his own work, and a good partner in the family. And I think that we raised a feminist son, and I talk with women about this all the time. It's our generation is a period of change where certain assumptions that had been in place were simply opening up. Mm-hmm. And to be in the transition thing is never easy. The path isn't clear.
And Joanne, I read a quote, I won't have it quite as exact as I had Virginia's, but it was something along the lines of every married working mom is one expected accident away from being the only breadwinner. And I know that's not exactly it.
Right.
That's, with the relative age differential in terms of life expectancies, even though that changes and it's getting a little bit closer together, that's still a very, very...
It is.
It's a true statement and always was, but I think it carries over with now most, that may be too strong, many families, 2 incomes, the expectation of both mom and dad working.
Right. And, this is what I've been working on just very recently. That's why I was in Washington, D.C. Actually, just last week, there was a conference that the Social Security Administration hosted on financial literacy. And what I'm really, invested in working on now is women's financial literacy. And, as you've both been saying, I think it starts with having a family unit that's working together as a unit. Unfortunately, there's external environment factors that are still, need some fine-tuning, to say the least, because it is a fragile financial situation that I think we're all living in, and women, unfortunately, are still in a bad place because of the quote-unquote choices they make in order to balance both their family and their paid work responsibilities. It does put one in an interesting place in their 50s because, yes, life expectancy is different.
Well, and most married couples, one does the finances and one doesn't. And I don't know why that happens, and it's not gender specific by any means, but over the years, and I actually used to teach a course about this, but over the years, it's always been amazing to me that the basic questions of, okay, do you have a safety deposit box? The answer would always be, oh, yes, we do. The following question of, do you know where the key is and do you know what bank it's in, was amazing how often in either gender case had no idea and wouldn't have known. They would have had to search high and low to find those things. And it's so amazing that sometimes the most basic financial literacy questions that I would lump that in with are not thought about until
a moment of crisis.
Exactly.
And then, quite frankly, in recent years, it's gotten a lot more complex. So one might have been considered financially literate 20 years ago, but that knowledge is far from sufficient now. It's become a very complicated personal situation and worldview.
I give a lot of credit to the media personality Susie Orman for raising this question very bluntly and strongly for women, saying, you cannot afford to take the position that your husband will take care of all this. It's not an adult way to deal with your life. And I think she's been very effective in raising consciousness there.
And I do think that in a lot of families it's split up. Most women I know are very focused in on top of the day-to-day.
And the men do the investments.
Exactly. So the women are in the here and now, and the men are in the future. But, women need to look out for their futures as well. So I think, we still have our work cut out for us.
And I think, speaking as a historian, that period, the post-war period, our parents' generation, until about 1970, was actually a kind of unusual period in terms of the economy, in terms of the wage, the standard of living, blue-collar wages very high at that point. And it was entirely possible for most working men to support a family.
Well, the GI Bill was huge in kind of leveling
that out.
Field.
And the federal government put enormous amounts of subsidy into building the subdivisions, not only the loans for Federal Administration and Federal Housing Authority, but the construction loans to actually build these places were all underwritten by the federal government. So that post-war vision of the family in the single-family house, dad going off to work in the one car, and mom looking after the kids, was constructed. It was kind of the gift after the trauma of the Second World War. But historically speaking, it was only economically viable for a short period of time, and only for people who were working to middle class to begin with.
We're almost at the end of our time, and I have a reaction question that I want both of you to answer, and it's historically and quite frankly the other program guests have enjoyed answering it. Your memory of where you were, what you were doing, the impact of two events that we, all three of us, share, and that is the assassination of President Kennedy and the morning of September 11. So, Joanne, why don't we start with you, and we'll end with this question. So.
Okay. Well, yes, I was at Lincoln School in 6th grade, and I remember it was right around lunchtime, I believe, that the news got out. And so, if I recall correctly, they just dismissed class for the rest of the day, and we went home and stayed home. And it was obviously quite shocking to everyone. And I know a lot of people have said they remember people crying. I don't remember that. I actually had a male teacher, which was kind of atypical back then. But, it was just such a shock because I remember the years moving up to that in the Cold War and the Cuban Missile Crisis, and even as a child being very, very affected by that. So it was just like emotionally jarring thinking about, our
and
security.
September 11th?
And September 11th was really unusual for me. I happened to be on my way to a conference in the city. And as I was sitting, kind of parked in traffic on the Eisenhower, it rolled out. And so the whole day I was in a conference at the Hilton, and people were glued to the television. And by the time I left, and they were going back and forth about whether they should follow through, there were people coming in from all other parts of the country. And they decided to plow through it. It was about sponsorships and things, but it was obviously very difficult. And there were actually people at the conference who had comrades, colleagues in the buildings.
Yeah.
And so it was quite shocking. By the time I left, the middle of Chicago was a ghost town because they had evacuated, and dismissed a lot of people. It was
Virginia?
Well, both of my remembrances here are in the context of college. I was in college at Knox College in Galesburg, and the news came out, and people were just sort of walking around as if they just couldn't process what had happened. And then we spent the weekend glued to the television in the student lounge and such, all those poignant moments. It just seemed incomprehensible at the time. And very quickly, of course, they began to make the analogies with President Lincoln, and that seemed to give a little shape to things. But I just remember thinking, how could this possibly happen? And then, of course, it was only the beginning of a series of devastating assassinations. September 11th, I was also in college, this time when I was teaching at the University of North Carolina in Wilmington, and we were having a meeting of the professors who taught in the public history graduate program, a sort of a closed-door meeting, and someone knocked on the door and said, do you know what's been done? No. And they said, well, they've attacked the World Trade Center. And then, of course, we went out and, again, glued to the television. But I remember thinking, I have to meet my classes. I have to provide some kind of an adult figure for these students, as no one did for me all those years previous. Mm-hmm. And to try to get them to understand what this could possibly mean symbolically. And then beyond that, it's just a blur. One thing I will say is that in Wilmington, North Carolina, which was a very heritage-minded community, the transformation that happened after 9/11 was all those Confederate flags were put away, and people flew the American flag from their porch, and I was grateful to see that.
Right. Oh, and I have to add, I remember a couple of other things after that. It was so eerie. Being in Elmhurst, that we're under flight paths, and especially in our neighborhood,
Right.
No.
It was so strangely quiet when the planes all just landed and stayed down. And then, to your point, then American flags just started coming up everywhere. And I'm not, typically a really gung-ho patriot,
Flag waver.
Right, but I felt myself
Absolutely.
compelled to go out
Sure.
and get a flag and put it on the house, because we all felt like we were
we'd all
vulnerable.
lost.
Right.
We'd all lost.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it did bring this feeling of nationality to us.
Right.
Well, thank you so much, both of you, for
Our pleasure.
being here in this installment of Elmhurst Time Travelers, and I hope you'll enjoy seeing it as it will air on Elmhurst, Our Kind of Town on Comcast for a whole month coming up. So
I'll send out postcards.
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you both
It's
again.
been so much fun.
And on behalf of Elmhurst Time Travelers, I want to wish everyone happy holidays, and we will see you again. Thanks for watching.
Hi, I'm John Quigley, President and CEO of the Elmhurst Chamber of Commerce and Industry. In these challenging economic times, it's imperative that our residents and businesses band together to not only shop Elmhurst, but buy Elmhurst whenever possible. We have great stores in our city center, Spring Road, Butterfield Road, York and Villette Streets, St. Charles and Route 83, North Avenue and Lake Street, along North York and even Grand Avenue. I ask for your help. Let's keep our tax dollars in Elmhurst.
Have you visited the Elmhurst Public Library lately? The Kids Library is a wonderful place, especially with our many exciting children's programs. The second floor is home to the adult and teen collections. From research to magazines, we've got it. We have more than 80 computers throughout the building. Or bring your own laptop. The entire building has wireless access. Need a quiet place to study? Try our silent study rooms. Book one of our spacious meeting rooms for your group. Our convenient book drop and drive-up window make picking up and returning library materials a breeze. And don't forget, EPL is open 24/7 online at elmhurstpubliclibrary.org.